Okay, this is a quick integer chip review, and your job here is to complete the integer chip table below. So by now everybody should have tried a few of these tables. We're going to try to use the zero property of addition to complete this. So if you look at the first problem here, number 1, you start with 3 negatives and 1 positive. So each red is a negative and each black is a positive. Okay, so if you have 3 negatives and a positive, your number sentence is just going to start like that, -3 plus 1 positive. Then we have to look here. It says to add 2 positives. So we're going to add 2 positives. And then we have to figure out what we're going to end with. So just thinking about the problem, if you have 3 negatives down here and that 1 positive, and then you have to do that's the start with right here. Then you add 2 positives.
Make sure you're in.
What you're going to hopefully notice is that for every 1 negative, there's also a positive. So each one of these makes a 0. So we end up with 0. And if you did it with the algorithm, 3 negatives and 1 positive leave us with 2 negatives. And then 2 negatives and 2 positives ends up with a 0. So your number sentence is just this. Okay. Let's try number 2. Number 2 is a working backwards problem. A little bit different than this one, so let's clear this. And maybe think of bringing in another page here. Let's add a page in. And think of the number line as an example. There's different ways to do these. So on the number line, the first information that you have here is that you have to subtract 2 negatives from something. So this is 0, and you have to subtract 2 negatives and end up with 4 positives on the number line. You know that you have to end up here, but we have to subtract 2 negatives. So when you subtract 2 negatives, you are taking some beginning number which we don't know, and we're subtracting 2 negatives. And we're ending up with 4 positives. So remember, instead of this being a subtraction problem, it's the opposite of subtraction. So this is like an addition problem. So we are going to have to go this way on the number line to get to 4. Can you think of where we would be starting then? Hopefully you remember that you always start at 0, and we would have to get to the beginning of that yellow arrow. So the question mark should be 2, take away 2 negatives should be equal to 4. So the number sentence is 2, take away 2 negatives equal to 4. If you try it with the integer chips, that might be easier for some of you and harder for others of you. Let's just try looking at it that way. So somehow I have to have a beginning circle, and I have to figure out what goes in that beginning circle. This is my ending circle. And what I know is I have to be able to take 2 negatives out of this circle and end up with 4 positives. So if you look at this as working backwards, imagine that you have these two negatives to take out. But remember, the result of taking these negatives out is that I would have to end up with 4 positives. So go ahead and imagine if there were 4 positives in here. Now, I could take 2 negatives out, and I would end up with 4 positives. So to really correctly, in the most simple way, figure out what goes up in this spot right here, take a look at this beginning circle and remember that 1 positive and 1 negative makes a 0, and another positive and another negative makes a 0. So really the starting value should just be 2 positives. So you have, on that problem, you have either the integer chip way, like on the left-hand side of the screen here, or the number line way on the right-hand side of the screen. Let's look at problem 3 here. You have 4 positives. You have to do something right here to end up with 6 negatives. So we know we have 4 positives. You have to do something to end up with 6 negatives. So let's try starting with the integer chips. Oops. Get rid of all of this. A little bit bigger. Okay, so we're going to start with 4 positives in our beginning circle. That's what we have to begin with. We have to do something to end up with 6 negatives over here. So again, the integers are kind of tough abstract thinking. You have trouble with that abstract thinking. A great idea for some of you is to start with the number line and see if you can reason it that way. Either way is fine. So I know that I'm going to start with 4 positives. So this is 4. And then I have to end up all the way back at -6. So that means I have to do something to go this way. So I could either think of this as a subtraction problem. And in that case, I would write subtract. And then keep in mind, if you look up here, this total distance would be 10 units. So I'm subtracting a positive 10. So my number sentence would be 4 take away 10. I think that's the easiest way to do it. With the integers, if you have to end up with 6 negatives, you would have to add zeros here. So that's a 0. So the green circle, this circle here, still has a value of 4. You would have to keep doing that until I could subtract 10 positives. So I'm adding in zeros. This is a 0, this is a 0, this is a 0. I can't subtract 10 positives yet. I can only subtract 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I have to bring another 0 in. Alright. Another 0 in. And another 0 in. And now I have 8, 9, 10 positives that I can subtract out. And when I take those 10 positives out, I'm going to be left with all negatives. And I've got the 6 negatives. So what you want to do with an integer table like this is pick the strategy that helps you the best to fill in the table. So you don't have to do the number line and the chips. You just have to come up with the number line or the chips in your thinking so you can correctly fill out the table. So let's look at this last one right here. We're going to start with something and subtract 4 positives, and we're going to end up with 4 positives. So if you like the number line approach, you don't know where you start, but you do know that you end up at 4, and you had to do a subtraction problem to get there, which means we had to come back 4. Well, if we came back 4 units, they must have been at 8, which means we started at 8. So your number sentence would be 8 take away 4 equals 4. Should have been a really easy one. So over in the left-hand side, you'd have 2 groups of 4 here, or you could just put in a positive 8. Lost these guys here, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's a big quiz type problem for you to complete the table, and I'm going to post this for you to look at.